Welcome, everybody, to U.S. Institute of Peace's event, Pakistan's Post-Pandemic Economic Outlook. My name is Tamanna Salikaddin. I'm director of our South Asia programs at USIP, and it's a pleasure for you all to join us here virtually. The United States Institute of Peace is a national, nonpartisan, independent institute founded by Congress and dedicated to the proposition that a world without violent conflict is possible, practical, and essential for U.S. and global security. We're very excited that you all can join us today for this event looking at Pakistan's economic outlook. The COVID-19 pandemic, as you all know, has been a blow to many economies around the world. And in particular, it is a very difficult time for Pakistan, which had already slowed down in terms of economic growth considerably after experiencing a twin deficit crisis in 2018. It's also an interesting time because with the new Biden administration coming in the United States, Pakistan is also seeking to redefine its bilateral relationship with the United States on geoeconomic terms, trying to shift away from what is largely geostrategic terms over the last several decades. So we have an exciting panel today who will be discussing what's going on in Pakistan in terms of the economic outlook, how they're trying to restart the economy, change things around, work with the IMF, and rebuild relationships with the United States. So on our panel, we have Khurram Hussain is going to kick off. He is probably the most knowledgeable and famous economic journalist in Pakistan today. He works for the prominent newspaper Dawn. He's written for a host of publications. We're very happy to have him and his insights here today. We look forward to hearing from him. We also have Safiya Ghauri Ahmed, who's currently director for the South Asia practice at McClarty and Associates. And she has spent a lot of time in business development in South Asia, Southeast Asia, East Asia, but previously served both on Senate Foreign Relations Committee and in the State Department, working on Pakistan and other countries in the region. And we also are joined by Naila Naqvi, the founder and CEO of Pie in the Sky. It's a renowned cafe in Karachi. If any of you are in Karachi, you should definitely check it out. She founded it in 2001, and after several years of working in the hotel management industry, and today Pie in the Sky has 20 branches across Karachi and Hyderabad and employs over 200 people. And from Naila, we're really excited to actually hear the on-the-ground small business story in terms of Pakistan's economic growth. I'm also very happy to welcome today Uzair Yunus as our moderator. He has recently joined USIP as a visiting senior policy analyst. Uzair is we're very happy to have him join our team, and he himself is very knowledgeable on the Pakistani economy. And so without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Uzair to moderate this interesting discussion on what we see going forward in Pakistan. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that introduction, Tamanna, and I think we should just jump right in. I'll start with Khurram and then go to Naila and then Safiya for an international perspective on what's going on and what the outlook is. But Khurram, starting with you, we've really had an action-packed 7 to 10 days in Pakistan. The IMF program is resuming. We had a change of guard at the finance ministry, then a signal that Pakistan was going to resume trade ties with India, and then a signal that it was not going to move forward on that. And then the upcoming budget, issues related to taxation and tax to GDP targets. But also on the flip side, you have the government saying that the economy is coming back strongly and that indicators like cement production, steel production, et cetera, are on their way up. So how do you see things developing in Pakistan, and what's your take on overall macro outlook for Pakistan and its economy?
Okay, thanks for that, Uzair, and thank you also for that very generous introduction that I received over here. Let me just start off by saying I'm especially pleased to be on a panel with Naila Naqvi because Pie in the Sky's brown bread and croissants have been a fixture in my house for many, many years now. So thanks for that, Naila. And regarding the economic crossroads that Pakistan is currently standing on, Uzair, all the items that you mentioned are linked, as you well know. And at the moment, as you said, Pakistan is, the past 7 days have been action-packed over here because it seems as if we are at a pivotal moment, but there is a spoiler at play during that pivotal moment. if you just look at the sequence of events over the past, let's say, 1 week or 10 days, basically from about March 24th, 23rd till today, Pakistan's IMF program won board approval on March 25th on the back of the commitments that were made in this IMF program. Pakistan approached the private capital markets and floated a Eurobond on March 30th, I think it was. And 1 day before the bond flotation, the finance minister who had signed the document was in fact fired. And the finance minister who had done the roadshows for the Eurobond were fired. And on the day of the Eurobond, the first tranche of the IMF agreement arrived, $500 million. So $3 billion were lifted from the creditors after the board agreement at the board for the IMF program. And right after that, or at pretty much the same time, the key person who had made those commitments was fired and replaced by somebody else, Hamad Azhar, who in his maiden press conference actually said that these commitments that have been made to the IMF can be reviewed, and went on to say that the government's economic direction going forward is going to be pro-poor, not necessarily deficit fighting, which is what the IMF program aims at. Which tends to hurt the poor rather than be pro-poor. And then even went on to dilute the commitment that the government might put behind the critical state bank amendment bill by saying, well, we've introduced it to Parliament. We have met our commitment to the IMF because the commitment only extended to introducing that bill. From here onwards, we will let Parliament have its way. Which means that at least I read those words to mean that they're not going to put a particularly strong push behind that bill, and it could stand to be watered down significantly as it moves through Parliament. So what's going on? The way I see this is that the government is now getting cold feet about implementing the very stiff conditions that have been agreed to in the IMF, with the IMF in the latest program, and has decided very, very abruptly to switch horses in the middle of the street, right after the commitments are made. And the new finance minister starts pointing in an altogether different direction from the one pointed to in the fund. Number one. Number two, shortly after Hamad Azhar said this, suddenly word began to circulate from very strong quarters that Hamad Azhar himself may be replaced by Shaukat Tareen. Somebody who's not known for implementing pro-poor policies. In fact, the last time he was brought in as finance advisor with ministerial powers, back in, I think, 2009 it was. Incidentally, back then, he had also replaced Hafiz Sheikh. Hafiz Sheikh had replaced him right after. But that was also when Pakistan was about to implement a very, very stiff IMF program. And Shaukat Tareen basically saw the implementation of that program. So it seems as if some kind of a tussle is taking place within the government of Pakistan about the future economic direction the country must follow. And it would be very interesting to drill a little bit deeper into this tussle to find out who are the competing factions and what is the advice that they are tendering. But at the moment, it appears that at the highest levels in the government of Pakistan, there are at least two opinions about which direction to take. One of them leads towards the elections that are now in view for many of the MNAs of the PTI. And the other direction leads towards resumption of the fund program and seeing it through to completion along with relevant structural reforms. The two of these cannot go hand in hand for very long. They can, to a certain extent, be dovetailed together, but a point will come that they will necessarily diverge. We can discuss that later as well if you wish. But that crossroads is where we stand right now, and how this whole tussle resolves itself is what we will be looking for in the days to come. So very quickly, let me just take 1 minute to tell you what I will be looking for in the days to come. I have three things on my mind. Number one, I'm waiting to see when the IMF uploads the Memorandum on Economic and Financial Policy, the document that contains the details on the commitments that Pakistan has given to the IMF. That document will tell us about the fiscal deficit target that has been set, the revenue measures and the incremental revenue effort that needs to be mounted, the net international reserve targets that have been set, the public debt reduction path that has been committed to, and all that. It will give us an idea of how steep these commitments really are, and how far the commitments on the structural reforms go. On power tariffs, the automaticity of power tariffs envisioned in the amendment to the NEPRA Act, as well as the State Bank Amendment Bill. How far is the government committed to seeing these through, or to what extent is it the government's commitment to only introduce these in Parliament and then let the will of the Parliament decide what to do? That document will tell us. So there, you might notice it's been March 24th, I think, since board approval happened. In normal times, the document is uploaded within days after the board approval. It has been well over 10 days now, and we have not yet seen the document. So I'm curious as to the delay. Is the IMF also sitting back and waiting to see how things resolve themselves here at home in Pakistan before uploading those commitments and making them public? Last I asked them directly, their answer was no, it's just that COVID and the spring meetings have delayed things a little bit, but we'll get them up as soon as possible. But I can't remember the last time I saw a 10-day long delay in making those documents public after board approval, after the release of the tranche. Number two, I'll be looking to see who is really going to be the finance minister, who will be in the driving seat. Will it be Hamad Azhar or will it be Shaukat Tareen instead? And the third thing then obviously is once the dust has settled on that front and we know who is in the driving seat going forward, who's the captain of the ship going forward, is to ask them how strongly do they stand behind the commitments that have been given to the IMF, or to what extent do they envision a change of course. Once all three of these things have been addressed, then we will have a clearer picture of what direction Pakistan's economic outlook is heading towards. Jose?
Thank you for that, Khurram, and for that overall macro view. I have some questions on all these three things that you mentioned, and I think those are the things that we should watch out for. Before we do that, I would love some input from Naila here, who's joining us as well. From a micro perspective, Naila, from, on the economic front, things were not that great before the pandemic began a little over a year ago. Small businesses were hurt tremendously. And of course, now with these commitments that have been made, particularly on the taxation side, things will, and on the electricity side, it is expected that businesses will struggle. So help us understand what it was like on your side as an entrepreneur, as an employer of over 200 people, what it was like to go through the pandemic, and even now with the third wave coming in, and what would you like to see as a business owner, the government of Pakistan and its policies to go towards in order to have a recovery that is not only sustainable, but equitable as well?
Uzair, thank you for having me. Just one clarification, Pie in the Sky actually employs over 400 people. So, so the impact is even greater. But, I think the majority of obviously, worldwide, the majority of medium-sized businesses were, and in some cases, remain badly affected, by the measures put in place to try and contain the pandemic. Most SMEs in Pakistan work in a very competitive environment and find it difficult, to build up reserves. It's very difficult to build up reserves while also growing the business at the same time. So consequently, we do rely very heavily on, our cash flows to meet expenses. So, it has been extremely difficult. It's been extremely tough. And, Pie in the Sky, as I said, operates primarily in the food retail sector, which worldwide has been one of the hardest hit by the complete shutdown that has happened, globally, and especially also in Pakistan in sort of March of last year. So it's been extremely trying. It's been extremely difficult. As a business owner, I think it's probably one of the most challenging phases that I think anybody obviously has had to go through. The government did come up with a few sort of schemes. The State Bank did come up with a few schemes initially, whereby they gave loans to, sort of help you retain staff on, sort of easy repayment terms, and also with sort of low interest rates. So I didn't avail that. I preferred not to, but I know of a lot of companies that did, and I know that did help them sort of, ride the wave a little bit. So that was very useful. The other thing which the government, again with the sort of state bank did, was the a temporary economic relief financing scheme that they initiated, again with easy repayment terms, which I think a lot of has helped people sort of, despite the pandemic, sort of invest back in their businesses, because the interest rates again have been very low. So I think overall, yeah, it is the third wave. It's going to be tough, but the food in Pakistan, at least, the only sort of one of the main sources of entertainment that people have is food, So, in that way, I'm sort of relatively lucky also. That I am part of that sector, but it's been extremely difficult as well. Yes, when you talked about taxation and the sort of the rates, your energy rates that have gone up and all that is something that is extremely worrying. It's been extremely tough. I think, I don't know what to be worried about right now, whether to be worried about sort of riding the pandemic and seeing it through, or what we're going to be hit with when the government decides to implement whatever, is deemed necessary by them. So it's, it's not been an easy year, and I don't foresee it easing up anytime soon, depending on what policies or what is put in place based on what the government decides. Quite honestly, But I mean, I will say though that obviously, the pandemic was a shock to all businesses. But I think the way that we have kind of bounced back to a great extent also highlights the resilience of the of Pakistan's retail sector to a great extent. It depends on, I suppose, which sector we're looking at, but I think it's sometimes I think Pakistan's economy is quite an anomaly. It's sort of you see sort of, if you go out, you sort of see it's almost as business as usual, even though there is a global pandemic. So it's sometimes you really wonder how it works. It's fascinating. It's very fascinating, actually.
Thank you for that. And I agree with you that it is fascinating. And in many ways, the Pakistani consumer at least remains able to, at least on the upper middle class level, remains able to spend a lot of money. And we're seeing some of that even reflected in, for example, vehicle sales and things like that. So I would love to dive deeper into, some of the stuff you mentioned, particularly around not availing the financing schemes by the state bank. But before I do that, I would love to bring in Safia into this conversation as well. And Safia, over the last few weeks now, I mentioned at the outset, the last few days have been action-packed, but from an international point of view, the last few weeks have been action-packed in terms of this pivot towards geoeconomics that has been communicated by the Pakistani government. The Islamabad Security Dialogue obviously was sort of the roadshow to bring that perspective out to the rest of the world. We've seen the Pakistanis talk more and more about connectivity, including regional connectivity. And I would love to hear your thoughts on, given that you work with international companies and given that you're plugged into the DC circuit here, how has this narrative shift been received? And what is it that international companies, and even from your point of view, Pakistan needs to do more of to not only just have this narrative be a narrative, but actually be something tangible that changes the course of the Pakistani economy?
Thanks, Uzair, and thanks, Tamanna and Naila and Khurram. It's a pleasure to participate on this panel with you all. So, Uzair, like you mentioned, I'll start off with just sort of talking a little bit about the dynamics of the US-Pakistan economic relationship, but also maybe this sort of shift towards geoeconomics and maybe away from the geostrategic, geopolitical lens that the US-Pakistan relationship has been in, and then maybe sort of delve into what I call my list of issues that we hear over and over again from US companies and investors, multinational investors that, we hear over and over again, who either are interested in doing business in Pakistan but face hurdles, or are actively doing business in Pakistan and face hurdles. So I'll share sort of my compilation of the best, a list of the best that with you as well. So I'll start off a bit on the US-Pakistan economic relationship. And, I think there's been ongoing dialogue about strengthening the economic relationship over the years, and I think many of us who watch the government-to-government relationship can attest that, it's the same sort of, we want to expand trade and we want to do more between the US and Pakistan. And maybe we've seen a little bit more in the recent months. There was recently a call between Secretary Blinken and Foreign Minister Shah Mahmood Qureshi which referenced expanding trade and commercial ties. And both Secretary Blinken and President Biden are no strangers to Pakistan, but they do see Pakistan from that sort of national security, geopolitical, geostrategic lens. So it will be sort of an obstacle for Pakistan to make that shift away. And on the economic side, we can't sort of talk about this without noting that China is the elephant in the room. And US officials have repeatedly spoken about how Pakistan would benefit more by cooperating with the US than depending solely on China. And the pitfalls of CPEC, or the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor projects, have been highlighted on a number of these sort of bilateral exchanges by US officials. And I think on the US side, there is growing concern about China's influence in the region. So I think that's sort of the broader lens of the US-Pakistan relationship, and China being a little bit of the spoiler there. But Pakistan has publicly reiterated its support for CPEC, but it hasn't really declined that, there is this important US-Pakistan economic relationship, and that it seeks important, economic ties with US companies. So I think that's there. And I think that should definitely be reiterated. But, there's still this conversation, which is very much at a higher level of, yes, these sectors should be prioritized and we should begin to identify the areas of cooperation. And I think, having worked in government maybe, 10, 15 years ago, that conversation is still happening. And sometimes I'm wondering if maybe that conversation is better served for not in the government-to-government space, but rather from the private sector to be pushing for those conversations. So like you mentioned, a lot has been in the recent months spoken about this sort of shift towards geoeconomics and Pakistan's focus from geopolitics. And I think that the real issue there is that Pakistan really has to reach some sort of understanding with Washington on the strategic and security issues. And I really do hope that there's not this conversation taking place that is totally misguided, where you've got US officials coming in and talking about sort of Afghanistan and the counterterrorism issues, and Pakistan's legitimate desire to have the economic conversations, but they're going completely sideways and across from each other. And I think there sometimes maybe a clash from Washington's own objectives and Islamabad's objectives, and it could be on what this shift looks like. And for that to happen, for Pakistan really to talk about geoeconomics and emphasize economic cooperation, they have to enhance the value, their value as an economic partner, which means they have to strengthen their economy. And I'll get to sort of the nuts and bolts of sort of the issues that US investors see. So I do want to highlight just a little bit on, Pakistan is currently the US's 56th largest goods trading partner, with $6.6 billion in total two-way trade last year. And I just want to, just as comparison, just for comparison's sake, India is currently the US's 9th largest trading partner. So when Pakistan talks about, why aren't we given the same level of importance, or why is USTR not paying attention to us on trade agreements or trade policies or pacts? It actually has to do with the numbers. It has to do with how much there's a flow of goods across borders. It has to do about what the trade deficit looks like. And when you compare apples to oranges, it's a different comparison between the two. So maybe I'll shift a little bit to some of the issues that we see from U.S. investors. And despite sort of a relatively foreign investment regime, and what do I mean when I say a relatively open foreign investment regime? Pakistan's FDI laws in terms of how foreign investors can actually invest in different sectors is relatively open compared to other regions. So in India, there's FDI caps on all kinds of sectors, which is shifting, but Pakistan doesn't have that. But despite that, there's still all kinds of barriers for companies who are looking to do business. And the businesses that I work with, the US companies, what comes up over and over is, and when we present to them, hey, there's this opportunity in Pakistan, which we think you should take a look at, is the risk. And companies don't like taking risks. They want to mitigate risk, and they calculate the risk as much as possible. And what are these risks that we're talking about? One is Pakistan is still on the FATF gray list. This comes up quite often. And Pakistan was originally placed on the FATF gray list in 2018 due to failure to comply with requirements such as regulating money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. The last thing a US company wants is to be on the front page of the Washington Post or the New York Times because they were operating in a country that were, their funds were misappropriated or were laundered in some way, or were financing terrorism in some way. And so they're very concerned about the FATF gray list. So that becomes the immediate red flag. And I know that Pakistan has been taking legislative measures to sort of ensure that they're able to get off the gray list. And I think that's all great progress, but this continues to come up, and industries which rely on online payment systems and online money transfers and e-commerce platforms and financial payment platforms are really hesitant to invest in Pakistan because of the FATF gray list. So that's sort of one issue that comes up. The second issue that we hear over and over again is the high tariff and tax rates, but at the import stage, but also overall inconsistent tax policies at the provincial level to the federal level. Inconsistencies in how taxes and tariffs are collected at the stage of import, and then how they're collected later at the time of sale, and how those taxes and tariffs are difficult to recoup because a lot of these times businesses are unable to recoup those taxes at the point of sale, and so they're losing money, sometimes 35 to 40% on goods that are imported into Pakistan because of the high tariff rates. So that's another big obstacle. The third thing I wanted to mention is the importance of a stronger manufacturing sector. Now, why do I mention this? Is because for Pakistan to be a part of a diversified supply chain, it really must, the missing piece of the puzzle is that they must get more goods out to markets. That's just plain and simple. And when we talk about major e-commerce platforms, the Amazons, the Walmart, all of these companies, when they think about the role of that Pakistan can play and how integral Pakistan can be as a part of their supply chain. This came up actually maybe a year or two ago when the 301 tariffs were impacting US businesses who were bringing in goods from China. And so many US companies were looking at alternative markets in South and Southeast Asia to diversify their supply chains. And they were looking at Vietnam, they were looking at Malaysia, they were looking at India, they were looking at markets where we have free trade agreements, they were looking at markets that were easy to get goods in and out, and Pakistan was not one of those. And I think in order to really integrate itself into a growing manufacturing sector in the global value chain, it has to be a part of this manufacturing sector, and it still lags way behind other countries in the region. So that's sort of my third point. The fourth point is the sort of delays and lengthy dispute resolution processes that we see in Pakistan. So, India had the same issue, and they've sort of started these fast track special commercial courts, whether it's for whether it's for bankruptcy and those sorts of resolving speedy dissolution of companies, or whether it's for sort of resolving issues that are IP issues or commercial issues. Companies don't want to be stuck in court for years and years on end, which oftentimes happens in Pakistan just because of long delays in the judicial system. And then the last two issues is the repatriation of funds. We've heard over and over again from US companies that have their money stuck, literally stuck in Pakistan. So they've invested it, they've been working on a project, and then they try to pull their money back. And from some reason, whether it's an archaic law or they're unable to get the release from the state bank, the money ends up being stuck in Pakistan. And this is sort of a big red flag for other companies who, if they are unable to move their assets in and out of the country, really see Pakistan as a red flag for investing. And then finally, what I'll say is they don't see enough investment and incentivization for R&D. And I think in order for Pakistan to evolve into a self-reliant economy, the way you've seen, when we hear Modi talk about Make in India, when we hear a self-reliant India, and even India doesn't do enough investment in research and development, but research and development is critical. And this ties into the ecosystem for startups, because essentially the quickest way to develop a product and deliver it to market is through startups. And how do you develop that ecosystem for startups? It's by innovative tax policies, it's for incentives for R&D. And I think that's really where we've seen Pakistan lacking, both from the private sector in Pakistan and from the government in investing in their own research and development. So I have talked long enough, Uzair, and that is my sort of list of issues. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Safia, and thanks for those. And I think that list of issues is great to press particularly Khurram on and see what he thinks about the appetite for some of these reforms that are needed. Before I do that, for the audience tuning in, on Twitter, our hashtag is EconOutlookPK. If you want to comment, share, ask questions. If you're on the YouTube page, feel free to chat in your questions on the chat box, and we will ask those questions from our panelists here. Naila, I'll bring you in here because Safia had a laundry list of sort of the big picture international investor issues that need resolution, or how Pakistan can integrate into global value chains. As an entrepreneur, what are some of the top of mind issues that you think Pakistan's policymakers should resolve in the near term? Particularly, let me phrase it this way. If pie in the sky has to go from 400 employees to 1,000 employees in the next 2 to 3 years, what are the things you would like the government of Pakistan to do in order to make that possible, or in order to accelerate the pace at which you hire another 600, 700 people? And the second question I have is, why did you not choose to take in the SPP financing scheme? Were there issues with the process, or was it just a business decision?
Okay. Well, I'll answer the financing one first. Is that was a business decision. I chose not to. This was for covering employee salaries for 3 months, but I chose not to. That way we were very lucky that our employees also sort of cooperated, and we sort of worked out a deferred payment scheme for them. So that worked in our favor. I will though say that I did avail the temporary economic financing scheme, and I did avail that, and I have to say that we were facilitated very easily and very fast. It was extremely fast, and I just did that beginning of this year. I didn't do that in 2020. Coming back to what, as an entrepreneur, I think everybody here knows that the tax structure in Pakistan requires a lot of work. I'm talking from, a very sort of small, basic level, is that, there is a lot of undocumented economy. There's a great undocumented economy in Pakistan. And, I just feel that till we sort of are all on a a level playing field, it's very difficult for businesses to progress. I do pay a lot of tax because that's the way I decided to to operate. I felt that that was the way to operate. Now I know that others may not be as forthcoming with their taxes, and then sort of it's very difficult. You're not competitive in the market. You're not able to price your product accordingly. So there's a lot that goes in. And anything sort of imports. I mean, though I do try and rely on a lot of local products so that I don't have to face that issue. But our customs duties have just gone through the roof. Things that were easily available are now not easily available. Stuff gets stuck at the port for a long time. Sometimes even if it's sort of in refrigerated containers, but we've had issues with. There has been a lot. There has been a lot, and I think the ease of doing business in Pakistan needs to change. It's not easy. It's not it's not a very inviting or very hospitable business environment. Unfortunately, it's a daily struggle. It's a daily struggle with different layers of different things that come in. So it's not an easy situation. So taxation definitely is something that really does need to be regulated. It needs to be. Sometimes you feel that you're taxed to the point where, well, it's just not profitable anymore to run a business. There's certain, sales tax and certain duties that, you sort of really hold your head at the end of the day. Sometimes I come home from work and I'm like, why do I do this? Because it's just, there are more obstacles and hindrances in your way than, people sort of clearing the way and saying, okay, you're sort of, an SME or SMEs are, I would like to think the backbone of any economy. And instead of making it easier for a lot of us to operate, it's very difficult. It's very difficult in the current environment. And unfortunately, like I said earlier, I'm sort of worried about how much tougher it's going to become with new taxation or sort of, energy rates having to go up or, anything. So, I'd like to be optimistic, but, I'm sort of cautiously optimistic, cautiously optimistic. But, I like I said, I don't know what the government can do to sort of, I'm not an expert on this, but I just sort of when things are thrown at me, I'm like, oh my God, now this, now we have to deal with this issue or this taxation, or somebody tells me, oh wait, we couldn't receive, because we also actually have a chocolate shop, so we import Belgian chocolates. So it's like sometimes you have and it's a very sensitive item, and sometimes it's been stuck at at the port at the airport rather for weeks, because they can't agree on which and though you've been importing it for years, they can't agree on which customs duty or which bracket you fall into, and it's like each time you do it, you're having to sort of go through the whole issues all over again. So it's like we did this last sort of 6 months ago, and sort of we're having to redo it again. So it's difficult. It's frustrating at times and difficult, but sort of what can one do?
Yeah, no, thanks for that. And so Khurram, I'll bring you in here because we've heard from both Naila and Safia the sort of issues both small businesses as well as international investors face. And to Naila's point, SMEs are the backbone of an economy. Let's assume there are 1 million SMEs in a country like Pakistan. If you remove obstacles in their way to the extent that they can hire even 2 more people in the next year, that's 2 million new jobs that are created in the economy. And that impact, no foreign investor, no Amazon, no anybody else can bring that in besides SMEs, because they have the scale across the country and it's equitable growth across the length and breadth of the country. But Khurram, then you have the IMF's commitments, and the commitments that on paper are commitments for reform, but in reality, they translate into this obsession over the current account deficit or raising the electricity tariff by 5 rupees at a time or 6 rupees at a time. From your vantage point and knowing some of the intrigue that's been going on in terms of who will drive the finance ministry, et cetera, and the election mode that is going to, the government is going to go into election mode soon. Do you see any sort of reforms coming on the horizon in terms of improving the ease of doing business in the country and making sure that not only foreign investors, but also small businesses like Naila's are able to grow and thrive in the Pakistani economy?
You know, listening to both Safia and Naila right now, I'm struck, in fact, by how disparate the challenges to investors in Pakistan really are. Those who are already operating in Pakistan, such as Naila, and those who are being invited to come and acquire stakes, such as the one that Safia has spoken to. And yet, on the other hand, how utterly rudimentary the state of our economic conversation is in this country. Because as you rightly pointed out, it tends to revolve basically around a few deficits, a couple of high-frequency indicators like large-scale manufacturing, a handful of vested interests, very powerful vested interests tend to dominate the voice with which one can speak. I don't think people such as Naila could speak above the powerful textile and cement industries of this country. Although one wonders how much innovation is going to come from the textile and cement magnates or the auto sector. On the one hand, we hear the government say we want to promote digital Pakistan, and on the other hand, they're banning TikTok, one of the most popular apps among the youth in this country, every other month or so. If it's not the government, it's a court, and now we'll wait to see who it might be next. On the one hand, they say we want to promote digital payments and a digital payments ecosystem, because without that, you're not really going to move into and have the kind of innovations you need to become a 21st century economy. And on the other hand, we see the FDR one day proudly announcing how they've served massive tax notices to all people using one particular digital payments platform, the only one available to freelancers who operate in the tech sector. Over here. Not that those people are necessarily tax cheats or something, and not that there's a massive treasure trove of revenue to be unearthed by the FDR's own accounts. It was only a handful of billion rupees, which isn't going to be a drop in the ocean given the scale of the fiscal deficit Pakistan's heading towards. But nevertheless, a pride and joy with which that was announced. And then the numerous other obstacles. So you just talk to somebody working in the high-tech sector and listen to them explain all the problems they face in a simple act of receiving a payment from their client abroad. And the obstacles are not only policy level or regulatory level from the state bank or the government, but at the banking level itself. It seems, at least my impression is, the banks aren't particularly keen to put a lot of their capital behind expanding their business in this area, regardless of how they may talk. They would prefer to continue just lending to government. Taking funds at 5% from the borrower. I'm talking about returns on savings accounts, not even current, and lending on to government at 7, 8, 9% instead, and just leave it at that. This level of risk-averse behavior, which is so deeply rooted among the banks as well, so it's pervasive. You know, the rudimentary nature of Pakistan's economic conversation, the kind of economic directions that emerge from within this conversation don't rarely ever go much beyond the demands of particular vested interests, which basically revolve around gas price subsidies, power subsidies, and a few taxes here and there, and a few customs duties here and there. Incidentally, another good example of the rudimentary nature of this conversation is the recent attempt to try and bring about a shift to geoeconomics by moving two proposals, one for sugar and one for cotton imports from India. And we saw what happened. We all saw what happened with that. It passed one committee of the cabinet, it reached the full cabinet, and over there it was suddenly shot down, saying that no, there are foreign policy implications involved in this. And the language that was used, if you look at the public language there, they said we are not ready for trade normalization with India. And one feels like using words of one syllable to explain to these people that two commodity-specific summaries do not amount to trade normalization. These are commodity specific. They are only opening sugar and cotton imports into India, allowing their transfer across Wagah border. How is that trade normalization, for God's sake? But you can see the level of the hold, or the level to which geopolitics has a hold over Pakistan's economic conversation right here, and in what happened over there. But across the board, when I talk to trade industry associations, even when you talk to government, the kind of representations that they get, I don't think the voice of people such as Naila and other investors in the high-tech side, or those who are actually innovating, trying to move out of the traditional cement, auto, textile sector industries, I don't think their voice even reaches the policymakers. I don't see much of an organized voice, first of all, coming from them, and wherever there is, it doesn't get much play or much traction up at the top. The conversation remains wedded to very, very old-fashioned brick-and-mortar issues. So I think something's got to change over there. And I don't think the IMF is the right player to look to try and change this conversation. It has to come from within. And I suppose to some extent, these people who are working in innovative industries, whether in retail or in services, need to organize perhaps a little bit better, network with each other a little bit better, figure out what are the common problems that they are all facing, where the government can play a role to help alleviate those issues, and then figure out how to advance those that voice so it can reach the ears of policymakers, engage perhaps a little bit more with the media. But all of that by itself, again, will bring about the kind of change that you sort of implicitly pointing towards, Uzair, if I understand you correctly. That change is more organic. It has to be, there has to be a high level realization, I think, in this country that business as usual isn't working. And until more is done to actually promote innovation, to unlock the potential of the youth in this country, to value and understand the new arenas that are opening up with the high-tech economy coming in. Bringing in Tania Idrous was, I thought, a great move in that direction. And the manner in which she left was a lousy move away from that direction. We need more people like her, I think, coming into Pakistan and contributing to not just the policy effort, but also the conversation, the policy and economic conversation in this country. Until that happens, I think it will remain business as usual. It's very deeply rooted otherwise. So there.
Thanks for that, Khurram. And to the audience that is tuning in, you can send in your questions both on the YouTube page now as well as on the USIP page in the chat box. So keep those questions coming. Safia, we actually have a question from the audience that I would love your thoughts on. And the question is, what is the future of economic relations with Afghanistan following the US withdrawal, considering especially that India is looking to also increase its investment and maintain its influence in the country as well?
Yeah, I think that's a tough one. I think that's a tough one, Uzair, given that, having traveled to Afghanistan and sort of during my time in government, the conversation was so security focused that I think, there's been little to no conversation about economic development in Afghanistan. And I think that's a longer term conversation for the country. I think it's going to have to be a regional conversation about how, the neighborhood comes together in support of Afghanistan's, economic development. How do they develop their own sort of indigenous economic platforms, their own payment platforms, their own banking system, their own infrastructure? And I think all of that is going to be sort of a tough call. And I think it's going to be a sort of territorial one, given the sort of regional interests from India and others in Afghanistan. And so I think, I think that's sort of much more further on the minds of at least US government officials at this point than I think, as it should be. It should definitely be sort of a huge part of the conversation, but unfortunately, I don't think it is. I think, just yesterday, Jen Psaki mentioned that President Biden has still not made any decision and wants to take his time on, the troop policy and the decision on the Taliban talks. And so I think that is very much on the forefront of US policymakers' minds. And, unfortunately, that still is very much the forefront of the conversation of the US-Pakistan relationship. And, and so I think it will be for the upcoming months and for the near future. So the economic one is a much tougher conversation in Afghanistan, particularly for the private sector as well. So, but it's definitely one that needs to be had, Uzair.
Thanks for that. And Khurram, there's a question from Ambassador Eric Olson here that would love your thoughts. And Safia, if you want to chime in, let me know as well on this one, because it is a big issue. It's been a big issue for a long period of time, which is the Reko Diq arbitration case. It's been going on for a long time. It has had an impact. And the question essentially is, in terms of investor confidence, how much of an impact does Reko Diq continue to have in terms of, creating this aura that Pakistan is not an investor-friendly destination and that you should shy away from it because of the fact that agreements like Reko Diq can go into arbitration for years and nothing can come out of it for a long, long period of time. So Khurram, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's not just Reko Diq, although that's probably one of the biggest examples of the kind of policy uncertainty, the uncertainty that investors face coming into Pakistan. But this overall tendency to seek to renew or review agreements after having entered into them whenever government changes or even court intervention. If investors cannot get a secure 20, 25-year horizon of some level of policy certainty, or whatever the gestation phase or whatever the horizon of the particular project is. If you're putting down $1 billion or whatever, a very large amount of money, and you aim to recover that money over 2.5 decades, you need some kind of certainty to know that the calculations under which I'm putting this money down will hold 5 years, 10 years down the road, and a new tax will not suddenly come in. Now, the number of time or some other reversal will not take place. So other than Reko Diq, what happened with the rental power projects, for example, a case that was launched back in 2011, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, and all the people accused in it were exonerated only in July 2020. And even then, NAB took the matter into appeal. So it's still continuing, right, from 2011. Even though Pakistan has lost that case in international arbitration, had to approach the government of Turkey at a foreign policy level, at the head of state level, and ask the Prime Minister of Turkey to do something to get that liability off them. They are continuing to appeal the matter over here. But there are so many other examples. The recent attempt to try and renegotiate the tariffs with the independent power producers. You can rest assured every future investor is looking at these and saying, well, if whatever agreement we come into under today is going to be reversed tomorrow. I'll give you another example from the special economic zones where people were told that your incomes will be tax-free up until a certain point in time. I forget the time horizon, but it was quite long, over the decade or 2 decades. Your incomes will be tax-free. And then one day they decided to impose a turnover tax. This is after the people had set up their plant and made the investment and started running. and they imposed a turnover tax. And these guys went to the government and said, okay, well, as per your own policy, it says it's tax exempt. And the government said, well, that's income tax, right? This is turnover tax. These are two different things. It doesn't say anything about turnover tax. That clearly, manifestly sounds like an act of bad faith. And so this does dent investor sentiment. Foreign investors particularly so, but also domestic investors. And it definitely makes people averse to acquiring long-term stakes, putting down large amounts of capital. And whenever they do, it encourages them to basically get their returns as fast as possible before the wind changes direction. And I've had people tell me this directly. They said, in this country, you're putting down some money, get your returns and your money back within 2 years, 3 years, because you don't know what's going to happen past that. So this policy uncertainty, in fact, promotes rent-seeking behavior. It promotes the kind of behavior that is very inhibitive of growth and innovation. For example, over-invoicing of capital equipment that you import. So if you've taken a large loan to set up a large plant, let's say a massive billion-dollar fertilizer plant, you will have an incentive to quickly recover that $1 billion or whatever it is you put down before the government changes its mind on the allocations of gas, or before the government changes its mind on tax issues or pricing of fertilizer or subsidies or any of the other things that are critical components of your cost buildup. So it not only dents investor sentiment, it actually promotes rent-seeking behavior, and it increases people's reliance on malignant kinds of investment behavior to seek outlandish returns in the short term while the sun shines. It's a very damaging thing, these repeated policy reversals.
Thank you. So we've had, a good sort of discussion on the issues that are there, the economy related to rent seeking, related to policy volatility, international investors having concerns around RICO Day. Naila, you also said that, on certain days you think about the fact that, it gives you a headache, all these issues with the FBR and electricity tariffs and customs issues, et cetera, then why are you doing this? But you are still doing this. You're a successful entrepreneur. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what is it that keeps you going in the Pakistani market, given the obstacles that are in the way, and why is it that you're determined to continue growing, and what is it about the anomaly of the Pakistani market in a good way that allows an entrepreneur like yourself and others like yourself to prosper and thrive and continue to push the economy forward?
At the end of the day, for me, Pakistan is home. This is where I was born. This is where, I live. So, I'm sort of, I can't see myself living anywhere else. So, if I wanted to sort of, continue with my business, and this is it. And quite honestly, I'm very patriotic. I am very, very patriotic. So I really want to, I think what gives an entrepreneur any satisfaction is being able to employ people to make a change in their lives, to help them sort of better themselves, to better their families' lives. I think that sort of really, is what drives me, at least, as an entrepreneur. Obviously, I sort of have a real passion for taking the business forward because I do feel that there is a lot of potential as well. Like you said, that anomaly it's a good anomaly because, even though, like I said, we're in a global pandemic, you still go out in the markets, or you still go somewhere, you do see people still, going about their daily lives. I mean, it is an economy that, a lot of people, unfortunately, are daily wages. So, you sort of need that economy to you need businesses to be open. You need, because that's how our population survives. And not that we have daily wages, but, I'm just saying that sort of, I think that's that, when you see people around you who are struggling to survive, who are having a hard time, then, I think it just pushes you even more. I like you said, I would love to be able to, scale up and, employ, 600 people within the next year, 2 years, or whatever it is. And quite honestly, that's one of the reasons why we did take one of the financing schemes that the State Bank offered is, we are investing in sort of new equipment so we can enhance our production capacity, open more outlets, maybe, move to new, across Pakistan. So, sort of create more jobs, help the economy grow that way. I mean, the issues that the business, the small sort of business community faces, they're not going to go away. I mean, I don't see them going away anytime soon. So, either I shut shop, which I'm not prepared to do, or then I just sort of battle my way through and just sort of make it work. You just sort of got to have that attitude of like a sort of that I'm not going to let it stop me. And you're going to sort of, no matter what, you're going to, bulldoze your way through and, create that environment where, you can sort of employ more people, give more employment, hopefully, just create more jobs. That's what it boils down to, really.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think it is, at the end of the day, that's what it should be, right? The conversation should not be about vested interests or subsidies here and there, but it should be, can you create jobs, and can you create formal, well-paying jobs that can help people improve their lives? And if the answer to that is yes, then the government and the policy environment should shift to create that opportunity. And I think that's what's been lacking in the economic discourse, as Khurram rightly pointed out, within the country for a long, long period of time. We have another question here specifically, and maybe I'll ask this question from Safia, and then Khurram, would love your thoughts on this as well, because Khurram, you commented on it just a bit as well. Is that, do you see the recent ceasefire between India and Pakistan in any way, shape, or form in the near to medium term benefiting Pakistan's economy? And I say that very cautiously. Safia, I know you're smiling because, I was joking with someone on Twitter the other day that if someone were to write a book about India-Pakistan relations, they could probably call the book "This Time is Different: A History of Indo-Pak Relations," because we always make that point that this time hopefully is different. So Safia, do you think this time is different?
I think I'm cautiously optimistic as, I think this time the thaw was much longer, at least in my sort of 10, 15 years of watching India-Pakistan relations. The thaw felt like the sort of freezing of the relationship felt really frozen this time. The fact that the dynamics of the sort of leadership in both India and Pakistan were such, and it really felt like things were going south. And for the conversation to have taken this upturn recently with the ceasefire, and then the talks on the Indus, the water talks on the Indus Valley, the river conversation, I think that, plus this conversation on resuming sort of bilateral economic, like Khurram mentioned on the sugar and the cotton trade between the two, I think is promising. I think we should be cautiously optimistic. I think there's obviously always a spoiler to look out for anytime there's progress in the India-Pakistan relationship. It's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But I do think that unlocking that bilateral trade between India and Pakistan could be a huge, huge factor for Pakistan's economic progress. And I think part of that is really sort of putting the geopolitics aside and looking at what's at play and what's in benefit of Pakistan's economic opportunities, specifically for young people, specifically when it comes to the service sector, IT sector, and how India has really revolutionized that sector in India and creating jobs. And I think Pakistan can absolutely do the same. And I think if there's more dialogue between the two, on the economic side, it's really about unlocking opportunities for the region. And you asked me earlier about Afghanistan. I think this could be a huge factor in that as well. And so I don't want to say this is the one because I don't know, but I am hopeful that regional players can also be helpful in pushing the conversation forward. I do think that the regional economic conversation should be a part of the conversation between the two. Usually it does start with like the water talks and the sort of territorial issues, and let's put those issues aside and let's actually start on the economic piece. And I think that actually might be a good starting point for the two.
I think we're also long overdue for a cricket series as well, so I'll add that to the mix. And I think you're absolutely right in terms of the normalization of trade. Cotton and sugar is not trade normalization. Trade normalization is when, for example, some of my friends in India stop complaining about the fact that they cannot find shan masala anymore in the markets there because it has to be routed through Dubai or some other channel and then ends up in India, and it's too expensive by that time. So that's an opportunity lost, not only for Pakistani businesses, but again, to Naila's point, in terms of Pakistani jobs. And if you can have a normalized trade relationship, then jobs will be created on either side of the border. Safia, you had mentioned China, and China is the elephant in the room. And Khurram, I'll ask you this question because you've covered CPEC extensively, going all the way back a few years to, I recall, the exclusive report Don had around the sort of what comes after the early harvest projects. And part of that argument was that, the Chinese will play an increasingly large role in Pakistan's economy, its agriculture, maybe its technology sector. How has all that panned out over the last few years, Khurram, from your point of view? And particularly also would love your thoughts on, do you see this sort of continued closeness if CPEC goes into, a next phase where this relationship deepens on the economic front? Does that have an impact then on the potential of a deeper geoeconomic relationship between Pakistan and the United States?
Okay, well, those are two very, very heavy questions there. Let me see if I can answer them in one go. I think CPEC has definitely slowed down, but it is not dead, as as some people have been saying. It has slowed down for two reasons. One is that it was supposed to slow down anyway. The early harvest programs were that. They were the early harvest part of CPEC. The real meat actually came after. The early part of CPEC, the early harvest projects were the precursor, you could say. And once those were done, then those were short gestation, 18-month projects to be set up in 18 months or 2 years, except for some of the hydroelectric projects, which will take a bit longer. But the vast majority of CPEC is not envisioned to be a project-based cooperation between Pakistan and China. It's actually a sort of a closer integration of the value chains between these two countries, particularly between Xinjiang province of China and Pakistan. So that is continuing. That's the pace. The special economic zones work has slowed down on those to some extent because SEZs are more complicated to set up. Investment is more difficult to incentivize and bring into the country than specific projects are, especially if those projects happen to be implemented by state-owned enterprises that are operating under state directives. But now that they are moving towards bringing in private entities from China into SEZs and into joint ventures in Pakistan, it was expected that there will be some amount of a slowdown. But they are beginning to now trickle in the investments. And I think it's entirely possible that in the years to come, there can be an uptick. In the years meaning between now and the year 2023, there can be a sharper uptick, and a breakthrough can still happen to promote the influx of these investments. So I wouldn't rule CPEC out just yet. But to your larger question about its geoeconomics of the United States, I know a few years ago, the Pakistanis used to try and tell the Americans with some amount of relish almost that we don't need you anymore. We have China. And look at all that the Chinese are doing for us. I remember one event here in Karachi where then Deputy Chairman Planning Commission, S.N. Iqbal, stood before an assembled gathering of diplomats and told them that the Chinese did for us what you should have done, pointing to the Americans, what you should have done after the Afghan War ended in the 1980s. You owed us a reconstruction package for the support that we had provided in helping bring down the USSR at that time, but instead you abandoned us and left. And today the Chinese are doing for us what you owed us back then. And he was likening it to the Marshall Plan in a sense. But today, I note that the Pakistanis are trying to seek to climb down from that line diplomatically. They're trying to say, well, we don't want to go too far into China's orbit. We're not getting as much out of China as we thought we would be getting. And I think there is an awakening taking place within the highest levels of Pakistan's foreign policy establishment, especially. And by this awakening, I don't mean something that has happened in the last week, but over perhaps the last couple of years, that no matter how much China is committed to you, the Pakistan still ends up needing the United States. Perhaps the principal reason for this is that this goes back to the rudimentary nature of Pakistan's economic conversation that we were talking about earlier. Perhaps one of the reasons for this is that the only thing Pakistan is ever really looking for from any big partner is bailouts, cash bailouts, to underwrite the country's chronic economic dysfunctions. And they found that the Chinese have a very limited appetite for that sort of thing. They don't really do they don't really do bailouts, let alone bailouts of chronic dysfunctions, where the party is going to keep coming back every other year asking for another couple of $1 billion. So, and then I think we're realizing that the architecture of international cooperation continues to be dominated by the United States. Whether you're going to the IMF or FATF, China is maybe an emerging power, especially in the region. Its power and its presence is it's very, very palpable. But I think at the highest levels, they're now realizing that they do continue to need good relations with the United States. And they're trying to find a way back into a way back to that place that they used to be before the relationship began to fray. So well, that's more or less it on that, unless you have any specific follow-ups.
No, I think you covered it well, and I would love Safia's thoughts on this as well, because I believe that the need for the United States is more than just the dollars. There are deep cultural diaspora, technological connections that Pakistan and its economy can take advantage of, and I think due to the mistake of Pakistan's own policymakers in Islamabad, they've routinely underestimated the value and potential of these linkages and always look to Washington for some sort of short-term financial support, as they are now looking to the Chinese. And you rightly said the Chinese are not in that type of game. Yeah.
Well, let me just quickly clarify. I didn't mean to say that this is a good thing, that the Pakistanis the only ask they ever bring to the table is cash assistance to underwrite their chronic economic dysfunction. I meant to say this more as a statement of fact, that like this is sadly the reality. This is how it ends up happening. There are dozens of other things that they could be asking for at that table. But for somehow, from what I've seen, the cash assistance is pretty much the only thing that it's the only ask that is ever brought to the table in relations with big powers. So I just wanted to emphasize, not trying to say that that's a good thing. And yes, you're absolutely right that the number of students who have studied in the United States, the diaspora that works in the United States, the United States as a source of remittances for Pakistan, and then market access for Pakistani goods in the United States and services and whatnot. There's a huge spectrum of possibilities that's actually open over there.
Yeah, and even from the technology sector and the linkages with Silicon Valley, there are extremely successful, qualified Pakistanis who have made it in Silicon Valley and beyond, and who would like to, contribute to the Pakistani startup ecosystem, for example. And that is a wonderful, connection that should be leveraged, and that has a lot of could have a lot of transformative, and is already having transformative impact on Pakistan's economy. Safia, would you agree that that's been sort of the shortcoming of or a lack of imagination on the Pakistani side, as well as like looking beyond Washington and looking at the rest of the United States and saying, look, we actually have a really successful diaspora that should be investing in the country, and not just in the next Beria town plot or the next real estate deal or the next Roshan digital account scheme that has been launched, but actually put stakes in the ground with capital investments that employ people and move the economy forward.
Absolutely, Ozair. I think those linkages are people to people. I think they're business to business. In Silicon Valley, you'll run across, so many people who are of Pakistani American origin who feel like they want to give back to Pakistan, and the way that they want to do that is by, empowering Pakistani people, by empowering the private sector. And there is a growing startup community in Pakistan. There is this drive of desire of young people they see innovation happening and they want to be a part of it. They need capital, they need the venture funds, they need support. And I think that's the sort of linkages that need to happen. Unfortunately, it's difficult. It's difficult for those to happen organically. And that's how the governments can provide that convening power and pull people together to have those conversations. I think that's a huge part of this, is that so often there was this Kerry-Lugar-Berman pipeline of billions of dollars of assistance that was coming over years and years, right? And so I think there was the conversation was so focused on the assistance that the US was providing to the infrastructure projects, to the civil society projects, to the democracy, all of these sort of great projects that the US government was funding through Kerry-Lugar-Berman funding. And now that the pipeline has stopped, the conversation has sort of dwindled, and the conversation shouldn't just be government to government, or from, the finance cooperation of the U.S. to the Pakistani government's finance cooperation. It shouldn't just be between U.S. aid and the equivalent in Pakistan. And I really think that has been the missing link between the two governments, is that they failed to bring in the thriving diaspora. They failed to link up the venture community, the startup community. And that's really sort of the driver behind R&D, that's employing young people, that's bringing in innovation, bringing in new ideas. And I think that's sort of relying on the government to do that for you is just not going to happen. And I think, and I think the government could be proactively providing a platform for this, which would be fantastic. But I do think that that's sort of a missing link between the two sides that has been missing for some time. And, the private sector can play a huge role in this. But unfortunately, the conversation has, as Khurram rightly mentioned, has shifted from, okay, so we've gotten assistance from the US, now that's dwindled. Then we'll get assistance from the Chinese, then that's dwindled. The UAE has dwindled. So that mindset has to change. And I think the mindset has to really turn into, how are we driving innovation? How are we being creative? How are we bringing in how are we facilitating these conversations? And, one of the things that I really commend the Indian government for is, and I could do this comparison a lot because I help US companies both in India and in Pakistan, is when the Modi government came in, is he hired, and Khurram mentioned Tanya Idrus, which is what really brought this idea in my mind, is he hired a bunch of 20-something, 30-something diaspora Indian Americans to come to India and serve in his government in positions to revolutionize and change policies, change the way we do things, because the way we're doing things is not working, right? And they were McKinsey types, and they were consulting types, and they were like the 20, 30-something Yale, Stanford, MIT graduates who wanted to come back and change something in, their parents' home country. And I think that same mentality is very prevalent in young people of Pakistani American origin today who want to sort of figure out, how do we do this and how do we change processes and policies? But is there really a space for them now in this government? I think that's part of the question, Ozair.
Yeah, and this has been, yes, Khurram.
Just very quickly, giving examples from India tends to trigger the wrong reflexes over here. So it's a carefully curated conversation when one tries to promote innovation and examples on innovation over here. But it's absolutely true that that innovation is the way out for Pakistan. And yet, at the highest levels of policy making, we see a doubling down on the old priorities, which is finding the resources with which to underwrite your chronic dysfunctions, to manage and muddle through those chronic dysfunctions rather than reform them out of your economy, and to continuously keep the shadow of geopolitics hanging over geoeconomics instead, regardless of rhetoric. Sorry.
No, Khurram, I think you summed it up really well. And I would just say that, even mentioning Bangladesh these days tends to trigger Pakistani. So it's very hard then to look around the neighborhood and say, what lessons can Pakistan learn? Because apparently everything seems to trigger Pakistani policymakers, in particular, when you compare or draw comparisons between India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. But yes, it is a conversation that needs to be had in a... China doesn't.
China is a good example to give, and then it's a matter of what.
Yeah, but yes, and in the Chinese example, then they also conveniently forget that the road to Chinese reforms ran through the Cultural Revolution, which again, as you mentioned, would require not to double down on the status quo itself, and that's a whole different conversation. But this has been a fantastic discussion. I thank the three of you for taking out the time, for joining us and sharing your insights and perspectives. And I think we can all agree on the fact that the policy conversation and the policy environment needs to shift towards removing obstacles, creating more pie in the skies, and allowing international investors, particularly the diaspora, to have long-term stakes on the ground in Pakistan. And that is the path forward for innovation, for employment, and for sustainable growth. And that the mindset needs to shift towards a mindset of inclusion, towards a mindset of creating opportunity, and not just using crises to ask countries like China, like the United States and others for bailouts and for funds. And I think the geoeconomics pivot is an opening to push that conversation. We don't know how far that door will open, but I think we can all keep trying and moving forward. And as Naila said, even when it drives us nuts, we can continue to push forward and see where we go. So thanks to all of you for taking out the time, and for all of you tuning in. Thank you for joining us. Please follow USIP on Twitter, on the YouTube page, and other social media channels to stay aware of all the events that we host and all the reports and published documents that we put out there. And again, have a good rest of the day.